Hello, everyone, and thank you for tuning in to today's webinar, where we'll be covering how to master data security with a deep dive into data security posture management, or DSPM. My name is Nick Ismail. I'm the global head of brand journalism and the head of tech trends and insights at HCL Tech, and I'm delighted to be joined today by Amit Misra, global head data security and data privacy practice Cybersecurity at HCL Tech, and Nikhil Girdar, Senior Director, Data Security at Security.ai. Before we get into the questions, I'd just like to set some context and remind our audience to submit questions for a Q&A at the end. We will try and get through as many of the questions as possible before the end of the webinar. So, the proliferation of cloud data is growing at petabyte scale, and with data breaches on the rise, safeguarding this data has never been more critical. How can organizations address this growing concern? Well, a new category of tools, DSPM, might have the answer, enabling organizations to place controls on data that's in the cloud or on-premise systems. Our panelists will delve into this topic and highlight some of the challenges organizations are facing, while exploring how you can apply some learnings to overcome these challenges to drive effective enterprise data security. Amit and Nikhil will discuss the current state of data in the enterprise, why securing data is paramount and why this is a challenge, and how DSPM delivers benefits and value. Right, so on to the discussion. The first question is, why is managing data in the cloud challenging for companies, and what are the common pain points that you're hearing from customers? Amit, could we hear from you first, please?
Hey, to start with, thanks, Nick, for having me here. I'm really looking forward to this discussion. You hear me well, right?
Absolutely.
Sure, thank you. So back to your question on challenges that you asked about for cloud. To the most part, I think the nature of problem seems quite similar to that what we saw in on-prem environment, except that the scale is 10 times, primarily because the data has just exploded. And other challenge which is quite evident is cloud is evolving by the minute, and it looks like that every time and every day when you look at your architecture, it looks like it is aging much faster, it is getting dated. Then if I were to give you top 3 issues are very quickly, just off my head, I can talk about that. Very first one is there are no surprises. We are still talking about compliance as main issues, and it's just that the cloud is kind of making it much more complicated than it was in the on-prem environment. And mostly because your data is now being monitored or rather managed by a third party, and most of the time you don't know what lies under the hood, and therefore that unknown kind of makes it a little bit of challenging for the enterprises. Second part is mostly, and I think this is the characteristic which bothers most of us, is the democratization of security along with the infra and data. Okay, that is kind of a defining feature of the cloud. Let me explain what I mean, because I can very easily, I believe, confuse people when I say that, this is something that bothers us. What I mean to say is, while on the surface, it looks like the responsibilities are clearly defined between who does what, the service provider, what the enterprise and customer do. But if you think about it, the developers have not got the controls, and they spin the machines by the minutes. And unfortunately, they are the one who define the configuration, security configurations for their machine. And when they are doing it dynamically, tons of machines every day, right there, you have a problem. You're at your hand, and most of the time they miss out on some of the other configuration, and there you go, all the breaches kind of are attributed to that. If you think I'm exaggerating, just do a little bit of Google search and realize that almost every cloud security incident is attributed to that. So that is what I think on top of my head, Nick.
That's great, thank you. Nikhil, do you have any kind of insights into why managing data in cloud is challenging for companies, and what are the common pain points you're hearing?
I think Amit summed kind of all the macro challenges really well. Only thing I'll add is add the data perspective, right? I think scalability truly has become a huge issue. If you look at the numbers, 2013 in 2013 we had close to 9 zettabytes of data in the world. Today we have around 110 zettabytes, and that is projected to go up to 175 zettabytes in the next 2 years. So we're going to be adding almost as much data in the next 2 years as we did in the last 10 years. So that exponential growth really explains the common problem that every single organization is facing, and technologies like cloud is really make it even more complicated. As I was saying, compliance being another area, just another interesting data point. I was looking at the numbers. 127 different countries have different global data protection and privacy laws. So imagine the complexity for a for a global organization. As you move, you have global supply chains, you have business with data moving across the globe, right? You have to understand the nuances and interpret each law. Even within US, even different states have those laws. So that creates a lot of complexity. Macro level, what I would say is like all of these challenges ultimately boil down to 4 areas of kind of pain points for customers. Amit alluded to security, and that is going to be the topic today. Data privacy becomes another huge concern. Compliance, as we discussed, and governance of data, right? I think being able to, as Amit, you were mentioning, like democratization of data, like balancing that need in terms of how do you kind of manage all your obligations, but at the same time enable your teams to use that data? That is the number one question every single organization is asking. As we hear, like Gen AI is kind of the board level topic. Every single CEO is bringing that up. To enable Gen AI, you need data. So you want to, that is the core purpose of collecting data. How do you get your teams to use data in a safe manner? So playing that balancing act is the number one kind of challenge on everybody's mind.
That's great. And so with this increase in scale and complexity, what are the most common issues faced by security teams when actually protecting the data? Amit, could you start us off, please?
You mean protecting the data in the cloud, right?
Yes.
So, yeah, so I would say that, I mean, I say it every day, so therefore I remember this answer. So it's like, I would say bringing in homogeneity in the way security is handled in a inherently heterogeneous environment. Okay. That was a mouthful, but let me elaborate a little on that. As you know that most of the surveys point out to that fact that most of the customers use at least 50 SaaS applications, multiple cloud service providers and all of them come with their own native security controls and features. So it so happens is that, for the security team, most of the developers and cloud security, rather the cloud architects tend to use those kind of native features, which does its job fine for that environment. But issue for the security architecture and security manager is that they now lack the visibility of what kind of controls are being configured in these individual environments. That, in fact, is a very big issue when you come to think of it, okay, as a security manager. Now, secondly, once you know that, how do you know that whatever is being configured is in line with your information security policy? And once you know that, and there will be different methods, whether they are simple or complicated, so cumbersome or whatever, but once you know that, the third and key challenge is keeping an eye on the sensitive data usage. So like what I think Nikhil brought out one good point that I had missed out earlier, privacy along with security. So we do have some kind of accountability and obligations toward the data that we are using. And these different cloud providers, when they're using this data, unless and until you have got a very good view on what kind of data, what obligation, how it's being used, I believe your security architecture is not doing its job. So that is kind of some of what I think. And just last point I would like to add to that is when I'm talking about kind of this kind of distributed kind of scenario where different SaaS providers or CSPs are giving their own native controls. Think from their perspective. For them the scope is quite narrow. From them the scope is limited to that SaaS environment or that cloud environment that they are providing. But from security architect's perspective, that doesn't cut. So what they have to do is they definitely need a mechanism which can centrally orchestrate all these controls, which can provide the kind of insights that they need on their fingertips. They should not be running around pillar to post to find out what exactly is happening. So that is what I think about the challenges that they need to address.
Thanks, Amit. And Nikhil, do you have anything to add to that point?
Yeah, I certainly want to add to the visibility challenge Amit was alluding to. And almost every single conversation we are having with kind of data security admins is like their pain point is when they log into AWS, Azure, whichever cloud they're using. The pain point is not what they see in the console, not the data that they see, but what are they not seeing? So that dark data and the shadow data system, like so many organizations are in the tail end, they're still migrating to the cloud. And many applications haven't been modernized. Companies are running MySQL, MongoDBs, and VMs in the cloud. And those systems don't show up in the console. So they're ungoverned, unmanaged by IT. How do you find those? And even within all the systems that you have discovered or hidden, there's sensitive data that's hidden. And like, but organizations, depending on the segment and vertical we're talking to, we see somewhere between 40 to 90% dark data. It's a massive problem. And though all those systems contain kind of sensitive data elements. And if your RDS system gets exposed as a result of a misconfiguration or a MySQL system that you did not know about, or some legacy database with logs, it doesn't matter, right? It's equally dangerous. So that deep level of visibility and getting the context around sensitive data is very important. And again, context also varies. What we often people hear from customers is like, help me make decisions, right? That is what context really means. Don't just throw me a bunch of dashboards and give me so much data points, but what do I do with that? Help me kind of drive decisions. And that quickly leads to kind of a controls conversation. How do I operationalize technical controls? Amit, you were mentioning misconfigurations, and I was just having a conversation with one of the CISOs. They have done a CNAP implementation, Cloud Native Application Protection Platform. They found close to 21,000 misconfigurations, and the team is kind of going nuts. Like, what do we do with this? It's going to take us months, if not years, to go fix them and kind of rally our developers to go fix those problems. They need a prioritization mechanism. Okay, where is sensitive data? What are the most critical systems where I can truly assess risk based on other dimensions such as laws and penalties and other kind of obligations? So that risk prioritization becomes critical. Same for access control. We have been talking about zero trust and least privilege for years, but how do you really operationalize that? It's a strategy architecture becomes very challenging. So teams are looking for, okay, can you give me a granular way that doesn't get into way of my developers? I don't want to blindly block access to my teams from using data just because I'm implementing zero trust. So how do you kind of handle that friction between teams? And the issues goes on, like data in motion. How do you kind of prioritize risk? So it's a long list of conversation. Ultimately, it comes down to how do you use the context around data to kind of prioritize your controls. I think that is what really everybody wants to figure out.
Thank you. And so you've both mentioned a lack of visibility, a lack of context, legacy data. Why do you feel the current state of cloud security architecture is not good enough for data security? An amalgamation of all those issues, I'm sure. And more, what gaps are the customers trying to fill? Amit, would you like to answer first?
Sure, Nick. So I think one of the challenge I think is probably because there is a tendency to cloudify your existing security architecture. So you have lots of existing investment, and suddenly you start migrating to cloud, and you decided to just kind of use it and extend it to cloud and see what happens. Uh, but it doesn't always work. And I think I will extend the point that Nikhil was saying just a minute back, and that's a fantastic example for this point. We are talking about lots of dark data. Now, when you talk about dark data in our on-prem environment, it has entirely different connotation. It has a different kind of meaning. The moment you talk about cloud architecture, it has entirely different meaning, and which was not a problem when we were completely at on-prem. Now, now connect this point with the earlier point of what I was talking about, the legacy security architecture. So if my security architecture is still addressing to that legacy enterprise architecture, it so happens is suddenly it finds that this is completely out of depth for this kind of issues. Now, most of our existing investments were to enable a walled garden. So where boundaries were defined, there were moat around our, fortress and all, and that is what we are trying to enable. But what cloud ended up doing was it completely changed the thinking, and the new mantra was mostly about democratization of the data, which I mean one key tenet of that is a freer collaboration and usage of the data, which is just the opposite of what we are doing in the earlier world. So when that happens, definitely the first point, it's purely commonsensical. It is quite evident that that old architecture is not going to work here. So I think if I've succeeded in kind of conveying that point, I think what essentially I'm trying to say is the point that is missing here is we need to first appreciate some of the key characteristics of cloud environment. And these characteristics are, first of all, your infrastructure, your data, and your complete inventory is not static anymore. It is completely dynamic. The kind of machine, data, everything changes by the day. So that is very first point that we need to see. And second thing we need to see is there was clear segregation in earlier world: who manages infra, who manages data, who manages the code, who manages the security. That somehow is blurring out. Now we need to appreciate these two key points, and that is something that the new security architecture needs to cater to. And yeah, I mean, I guess this, and along with the increased risk surface, that is something that we most commonly hear from the customer, which I mean, I have very strong opinion about that point as well, which I feel that, mostly when we talk about increased risk surface, that problem is to an extent right, but not that much as most of the people like to think. I mean, we have a tendency to think that cloud is inherently riskier than on-prem, and with that thinking, it looks like your risk surface has increased, uh, which may not necessarily be true. But that for another day. I think these are the 3 points that I wanted to convey across.
Thank you, Amit. And Nikhil, just before we move on to the solution to this data security problem, do you want to add anything on the current gaps that customers are trying to fill at the moment?
Yeah, I want to add actually a couple of examples to Amit's point, right? Like, why is the kind of legacy architecture not extending? And this is very important because in cybersecurity, we always have especially from a vendor side, we have kind of a tendency to bring new solutions to small use cases. But if keeping our customer lens, what we forget is like, okay, our organizations are dealing with so many different tools, CISOs, and many of those projects that were kind of tools that were procured 2 years back, they're just getting implemented now, right? And then you talk about these newer technologies, new categories coming in, like from a practitioner standpoint, it can be overwhelming. Okay, why do I need this? But in some cases, there are real gaps. In some cases, like you may not need something. Let's say take the example of data security. Still, many organizations are implementing DLP tools. But if you think about, okay, what benefit are you getting, right? It is certainly helping with exfiltration kind of detection on the kind of on-prem side, giving you some visibility on the structured data side. But there's a lot of unstructured data. Okay, how do you get coverage around that? Can you scale your DLP to your cloud environment? A lot of those solutions were not written to kind of manage petabytes of data. That is another challenge organizations are facing. The other piece is the classification techniques itself. A lot of the older DLP tools were kind of regex-based, rule-based detection mechanisms. But data, especially unstructured data today, like it is very hard to differentiate whether you're looking at a social security number, whether it's a SKU number. That context is not always. So you want to figure out a way that can reduce false positives. Just one example of how some of the older technologies, which are good enough, are not extending to the modern world. Same thing applies to like you have CASB and SSPM solutions. All of those have a critical role. But if you think about the macro lens, you still have a massive visibility gap in terms of data that sits in public clouds. Another challenge that we see is, okay, okay, you solve for the security in the public cloud, but what about, can you have a consistent mechanism? So you have to look at that architecture and from the lens that, okay, hey, how can you simplify it for your team? How can you make it easy to operationalize tooling? Because it's not just about getting the best tool out there in the market, but also can your team actually operationalize it? I think that is very, very important. So we have to keep that balanced view of technology innovation as well as kind of practical implementation.